I was 12 years old when I first understood what my brother Brandon could do with a computer. Not just the surface-level stuff that impressed our friends at school, the ability to make a website or fix someone's crashed hard drive, but the deeper architecture of it all, the way he could look at a problem and see it as a series of logical gates that needed the right sequence to open. He was 17 then, a senior at Riverside High, and already people were talking about him like he was something special. Teachers would mention his name in that reverent way they reserved for students who might actually escape our town and do something remarkable. Our mother would smile when she overheard those conversations at parent-teacher conferences, a smile that carried equal parts pride and relief, because Brandon represented possibility in a house where possibility had become a scarce commodity. I remember the exact afternoon when his talent became undeniable to me, when it stopped being just something impressive my older brother could do, and became something that felt almost supernatural in its sophistication. It was a Thursday in October, the kind of crisp fall day where the light came through windows at angles that made everything feel cinematic and significant. I'd come home from baseball practice still wearing my cleats, tracking dirt across the kitchen floor in a way that would normally earn our mother's disapproval. But she wasn't home yet from her teaching job at Lincoln Elementary. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of keys coming from Brandon's room upstairs, a sound so constant in our house that its absence would have been more noticeable than its presence. His door was half open, which meant I was welcome to come in if I wanted, and I did want, because I had nothing else to do, and homework felt like something that could wait. Brandon sat at his desk, surrounded by what looked like chaos, but I knew was actually a highly organized system. 2 monitors displayed screens full of code, text editors with hundreds of lines scrolling past as he worked. Reference books lay open to specific pages, marked with sticky notes covered in his precise handwriting. A legal pad filled with diagrams and flowcharts sat at his elbow, his method for thinking through complex problems before translating them into actual code. Empty coffee mugs formed a small museum of his recent caffeine consumption, each one a marker of how long he'd been working on whatever project currently consumed him. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes taking a moment to refocus from whatever mental space he'd been occupying. That was typical Brandon, so absorbed in whatever he was building that returning to normal social interaction required a visible mental shift. But he never made me feel like I was interrupting. He'd just smile slightly, acknowledge my presence, and wait to see if I needed something specific or was just hanging out. "What are you working on?" I asked, dropping my backpack and sitting on his bed, careful to avoid the stack of programming textbooks he'd checked out from the public library. He leaned back in his chair, stretching in a way that suggested he'd been in the same position for hours. "Something interesting," he said. "You know how, when you search for something online, you get millions of results, but only the first few are actually useful? I'm trying to build an algorithm that learns what kind of results you personally find valuable based on which ones you actually click on, then adjusts future searches to prioritize similar content. Basically teaching the search function to understand your preferences without you having to explain them explicitly." I had no idea what most of those words meant in a technical sense, but I understood the concept he was describing. It was the kind of thing that sounded simple when explained, but I knew must be incredibly complex to actually build. I asked him how it was going. "Good. Actually," he said, turning back to his screens. "I've got the basic framework working. Now it's just a matter of refining the weighting system so it learns quickly enough to be useful, but not so quickly that it overcorrects based on outlier behavior. It's a balance problem, which is the interesting part." He talked for another 10 minutes, explaining the technical challenges and how he was approaching them, breaking down concepts into metaphors I could understand. That was Brandon's gift, not just understanding complex systems himself, but being able to translate that understanding into language that made sense to people without his technical knowledge. He compared the algorithm to how I learned to recognize different types of pitches in baseball. seeing patterns and adjusting expectations based on what I'd observed before. He made code feel like something natural and intuitive, rather than abstract and intimidating. When he finished explaining, I asked the question that was really on my mind. Could this actually be something people would use? Like, not just a school project, but a real thing? He considered this seriously, the way he considered all questions, thinking through the implications before responding. Maybe, he said. The concept isn't entirely original. Other people are working on similar ideas. But my implementation is different enough that it might have value. The real question isn't whether people would use it. The real question is whether I can build it well enough to compete with what larger companies with actual budgets are developing. And can you? I asked. He smiled, not arrogantly, but with quiet confidence. I think so, yeah. I'm probably better at this than people give me credit for. Not because I'm naturally gifted or anything, but because I work harder and think more systematically than most people are willing to. That counts for a lot. That conversation stayed with me because it revealed something fundamental about how Brandon approached the world. He didn't rely on talent alone. He built systematic processes for learning and improving, treated every project as an opportunity to develop new capabilities, maintained discipline that most teenagers couldn't sustain. He was constructing himself deliberately, building the skills and knowledge that would eventually let him build the kind of projects that mattered. Even at 17, he understood that success wasn't about single breakthrough moments. It was about accumulating small improvements over long periods, staying focused when others got distracted, pushing through frustration when others quit. Teachers would mention his name in that reverent way they reserved for students who might actually escape our town and do something remarkable. Our mother would smile when she overheard those conversations at parent-teacher conferences, a smile that carried equal parts pride and relief, because Brandon represented possibility in a house where possibility had become a scarce commodity. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Claremont Street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business but pretended they didn't. Our father worked as a regional sales manager for an industrial supply company, a job that required him to travel 3 weeks out of every month. Our mother taught elementary school art, which meant she worked with passion and dedication for a salary that never quite matched the hours she invested. Between them, they managed to maintain what I now recognize as a carefully calibrated middle-class existence, one that required constant attention and provided no margin for error. The house wasn't large, but it was ours. The cars weren't new, but they ran. We took one modest vacation each summer, usually to visit relatives in another state, and we celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes and small, thoughtful gifts. It was the kind of childhood that felt secure without being lavish, comfortable without being extravagant. Brandon had claimed the smaller bedroom because it had better light in the afternoons, and he'd transformed it into something between a workshop and a library. 2 mismatched desks held an array of computer equipment, some of it salvaged from the school's donation pile, some purchased piece by piece with money he earned tutoring other students. Books on programming languages, algorithm design, and computer architecture lined makeshift shelves built from cinder blocks and plywood. I'd spend hours in that room, watching him work, asking questions that he'd answer with patience that seemed remarkable for a teenager. He never made me feel stupid for not understanding something immediately. He'd break down complex concepts into metaphors I could grasp, comparing data structures to the way we organized our sports card collections, or explaining recursion using the mirrors in our bathroom that reflected each other infinitely. The thing about Brandon that separated him from other smart kids I knew was his systematic approach to everything. He didn't just solve problems, he built frameworks for understanding entire categories of problems. When he decided to learn a new programming language, he wouldn't just work through tutorials. He'd create projects that forced him to engage with the language's unique features, then document everything he learned in detailed notes that he'd review periodically. He had a system for tracking his progress, for identifying his weak points, for challenging himself with increasingly difficult tasks. Even at 17, he understood that natural talent without disciplined application was just wasted potential. Our relationship worked because we occupied different spaces without competition. He was the brilliant older brother, the one who would probably get a full scholarship to a prestigious university, the one who made our parents proud in ways that involved academic achievement and future potential. I was the younger brother who played baseball reasonably well, who had friends who actually left the house on weekends, who could navigate social situations that left Brandon looking uncomfortable and out of place. We complemented each other. He'd help me with my math homework, explaining concepts in ways that made more sense than anything my teachers managed. I'd give him social intelligence reports from school, helping him understand the complex dynamics of teenage hierarchies that he found baffling. We were a team, though neither of us would have used that word at the time. It was just how things were. Our father's absence didn't register as abnormal because it had always been that way. 3 weeks gone, 1 week home. During his home weeks, he'd be exhausted but attentive, asking about school, taking us to baseball games, grilling steaks in the backyard on Saturday afternoons. He and our mother seemed happy, or at least content. They'd sit on the back porch after we'd gone to bed, talking in low voices while the summer insects hummed in the darkness. Looking back, I can see the signs that something was deteriorating. The way his home weeks gradually became shorter. The increasing frequency of phone calls that our mother took in another room with the door closed. The subtle tension that would settle over the house like humidity before a storm. But at 12, you don't have the framework to interpret those signals. You just accept what's in front of you as the natural state of things. The first real indication that our secure world was built on unstable foundations came on a Thursday afternoon in October. I remember the specific day because Brandon and I had been planning to go to the high school's football game that night, one of the rare social events he'd agreed to attend. Our mother picked us up from school as usual, but something was different in the car. She wasn't crying, wasn't visibly upset, but there was a quality to her silence that felt heavy and deliberate. Brandon noticed it immediately. He caught my eye in the back seat and raised his eyebrows in a question I couldn't answer. When we pulled into the driveway, our father's car was there, which shouldn't have been possible. He wasn't due home for another week and a half. Our mother turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. She sat gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the garage door. Brandon and I waited, understanding instinctively that something significant was happening, something that required patience rather than questions. Finally, she spoke without turning around. "Your father is inside," she said. "He came home early because we need to have a family conversation. I want you both to know that your father and I love you very much, and that nothing about this situation changes that fundamental fact. Whatever happens next, you are the most important thing in the world to both of us." The words felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them during the drive home. Brandon's hand found my shoulder in the back seat, a brief squeeze that meant, "Stay calm." We walked into the house together, our backpacks still on, as if keeping them might mean this would be brief and we could still make it to the game. Our father sat at the dining room table, his suitcase still by the front door, his face carrying an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite guilt, and it wasn't quite sadness. It was resignation, the look of someone who'd made a decision and was now committed to following through, regardless of the cost. He gestured for us to sit. Our mother stood by the kitchen counter, her arms crossed, her face carefully neutral. The conversation that followed lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it reorganized everything I understood about how the world worked. Our father explained, in language that tried to be gentle but ultimately just sounded clinical, that he'd been unhappy for years, that the marriage had become something he could no longer sustain, that he'd met someone else, someone he'd been seeing for 8 months, someone who made him feel alive again, that he was moving to Phoenix, where his company had offered him a position that would allow him to stop traveling, that he would send money for child support, that we could visit during summers and holidays, that this wasn't about us, that he still loved us. I watched Brandon's face during this recitation. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He just listened with an intensity that seemed to absorb every word, processing the information the way he processed everything, looking for the underlying structure. When our father finished, there was silence. Our mother's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, tears running down her face, though she made no sound. Our father looked at us, waiting for questions or accusations or anything that would allow him to respond. Brandon stood up. The backpack was still on his shoulders, as if he'd been right about this being brief, though not in the way he'd hoped. He looked at our father with an expression I couldn't read, then spoke in a voice that was perfectly steady. "When are you leaving?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," our father said. "I've already rented an apartment in Phoenix. I'll come back next month to get the rest of my things." Brandon nodded once, then walked upstairs. I heard his bedroom door close with careful precision, not slammed but firmly shut. I sat there for another moment, looking between our mother and our father, trying to understand what was expected of me. Finally, our mother spoke. "Go check on your brother," she said softly. I found Brandon sitting at his desk, his computer booted up, his hands on the keyboard though he wasn't typing. The room felt smaller suddenly, the careful organization of his equipment and books now seeming like a child's attempt to create order in an inherently chaotic world. I sat on his bed and waited. After a long silence, he spoke without turning around. "We're going to be okay," he said. "Mom makes enough to cover the mortgage if we're careful. Child support will help with the basics. I can increase my tutoring hours. You'll keep playing baseball. We'll figure it out." Even then, at 17, he was already calculating, already building a framework for survival. It wouldn't occur to me until years later that he'd never said a word about his own plans, about the universities he'd been researching, about the future he'd been building. In that moment, in the space of a 15-minute conversation, he'd reconfigured his entire trajectory around a new primary objective: keeping our family stable. The next morning, our father left while Brandon and I were at school. He didn't wake us up to say goodbye. When we came home, his car was gone from the driveway, and the house felt different, the way a room feels different after you've removed a large piece of furniture, the space both larger and somehow diminished. Our mother had made dinner, a forced normalcy that none of us acknowledged as forced. We ate and talked about school and homework, maintaining a careful pretense that everything was fine. Over the following weeks, the reality of our new situation became clear. Our mother's salary alone couldn't quite cover everything. There were no dramatic shortfalls, no immediate crisis, but the margins had disappeared. Small luxuries evaporated. Eating out became a memory. New clothes became strictly necessary replacements. The thermostat got turned down in winter and up in summer. Brandon started tutoring 3 afternoons a week and both days on weekends, coming home tired and going straight to his room to work on his own projects. I'd hear him at his computer late into the night, the soft clicking of keys like a heartbeat keeping the house alive. The child support payments came, but they were less than our mother had hoped and less than they should have been legally. Our father's new position apparently came with a pay cut that reduced his obligations. Our mother consulted with a lawyer who explained that fighting it would cost more than any increase would yield. So she accepted what came and adjusted accordingly. She took on additional responsibilities at school, chaperoning events and running after-school programs for extra small stipends. She stopped getting her hair done professionally. She started shopping at discount grocery stores and using coupons with a dedication that would have embarrassed her a year earlier. She never complained, never spoke badly about our father in front of us, never allowed her exhaustion to manifest as anger. But I could see it wearing on her. The lines around her eyes deepened. Her smile became something she had to construct rather than something that emerged naturally. She'd sit at the dining room table late at night with her laptop and a calculator and stacks of bills, her face illuminated by the screen's cold light, and I'd watch from the stairs as she moved money between accounts, trying to make the math work. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, and she'd sit back with her hands over her face, breathing slowly, before returning to the problem with renewed determination. Brandon saw all of this too. He never mentioned it directly, but I noticed changes in his behavior. He started accepting every tutoring request that came his way, even the difficult students who frustrated other tutors. He created a website offering his services and posted flyers at the library and community centers. He began charging slightly more, positioning himself as a premium option, and students paid it because he delivered results. When he wasn't tutoring or sleeping, he was working on his own projects with an intensity that seemed to border on obsession. I asked him once what he was building. We were in his room on a Saturday afternoon. I'd finished my homework and had nothing to do, and I'd wandered in to find him completely absorbed in his work, multiple windows open across 2 monitors, his face bathed in the blue-white glow. Something important, he said, without looking away from the screen. Something that could change things for us. That's when I learned about the National Technology Innovation Challenge. It was a competition sponsored by a consortium of tech companies and universities, designed to identify exceptional student talent. Participants would design and build a complete software project addressing a real-world problem, then present it to a panel of judges. The winners would receive substantial grants, ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, plus guaranteed admission and full scholarships to partner universities. The competition was fierce, drawing the best student programmers from across the country. But Brandon had decided he was going to win it. Not try to win it, win it. He explained his project to me over the following weeks, breaking it down into concepts I could understand. He was building a platform that would connect nonprofit organizations with volunteers based on skill matching and geographic proximity, using machine learning to improve the matching algorithm over time. It was ambitious, technically sophisticated, and addressed a genuine need. More importantly, he explained, it was exactly the kind of socially conscious application that judges in these competitions responded to. He wasn't just building something impressive, he was building something that would win. I became his assistant without formally agreeing to the role. He'd have me test interfaces, clicking through screens while he watched how I navigated, where I got confused, what felt intuitive. He'd explain features, and I'd try to use them like a normal person would, someone without his technical expertise. When I found something confusing, he'd redesign it. When something worked smoothly, he'd make note of what made it successful. We developed a rhythm. I'd come home from baseball practice, do my homework, then spend an hour or two helping him test while he refined and improved. The project consumed him entirely. He stopped accepting new tutoring students, maintaining only his existing commitments. He ate at his desk, slept in short bursts, developed a pallor that worried our mother. But the platform took shape, growing from a rough prototype into something polished and genuinely impressive. I could see it even without technical knowledge. The interface was clean and intuitive. The matching algorithm actually worked, connecting test users with appropriate opportunities. The presentation materials he was preparing were professional and compelling. He was building something real, something valuable, and he was doing it with a desperation that went beyond normal ambition. Our mother tried to get him to ease up, to take breaks, to remember that he was still a high school student who needed sleep and social interaction. but she also understood what was driving him. The grant money could stabilize everything. $50,000 would mean she could stop working extra hours. It would mean security for college for both of us. It would mean the margins returned, so she didn't push too hard. She'd bring food to his room and make sure he ate. She'd remind him to shower and sleep, but she let him work. The competition deadline was in March. His presentation scheduled for early April. He submitted his entry in February and was notified within a week that he'd been selected as one of 30 finalists from over 3,000 applicants. The notification email was brief and formal, but it meant everything. He was going to the national finals. He was going to present to judges who could change our family's trajectory. For the first time since our father left, I saw something like hope replace the exhaustion in our mother's eyes. Mr. Harrison Thornton taught advanced computer science at Riverside High, a position he'd held for 12 years. He was in his mid-40s, tall and thin with graying hair. He wore slightly too long, as if holding on to a younger version of himself. Students generally liked him. He ran the computer lab with an easy authority, made jokes during lectures, stayed after school to help anyone who asked. He sponsored the coding club and organized field trips to tech companies in the area. On paper, he was exactly the kind of teacher who made high schools better places. But there was something performative about his engagement, a quality I couldn't name at 12, but recognized instinctively. He liked being seen as the cool teacher, the one who got it, the one students connected with. His enthusiasm seemed calibrated for effect rather than emerging from genuine passion. Brandon had been one of his favorite students during junior year. Thornton would reference Brandon's work when teaching new concepts, hold up his projects as examples, recommend him to other teachers as someone who could help with technical problems. But their relationship shifted during senior year in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly apparent. It started with small comments during class, observations that carried an edge that hadn't been there before. When Brandon would ask a sophisticated question, Thornton would respond with praise that somehow sounded like skepticism. "That's very advanced thinking," he'd say, with an emphasis that made it sound like a question rather than a compliment. The change accelerated after Brandon became a finalist in the National Technology Innovation Challenge. Thornton had asked to see the project, and Brandon had demonstrated it during an after-school session, walking through the features and explaining the technical architecture. I wasn't there for that meeting, but Brandon told me about it afterward. Thornton had been quiet during the demonstration, asking few questions, his expression unreadable. At the end, he'd said it was impressive work, then added that he hoped Brandon had documented all his sources and influences properly, given how sophisticated the implementation was. The comment bothered Brandon more than he wanted to admit. That night in his room, he kept returning to it, trying to parse what Thornton had meant. I reminded him that the project was entirely his own work, that he'd built everything from scratch, that there was nothing to worry about. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Brandon being Brandon, he couldn't let it go. He went through his entire code base, adding extensive comments, documenting his thought process and implementation decisions. He compiled a bibliography of every resource he'd consulted, every tutorial he'd watched, every documentation page he'd referenced. He created a detailed log of his development timeline, showing the progression of the project from initial concept to finished product. It was defensive work, preparation for accusations that hadn't been made explicit, and doing it took time away from final refinements. 2 weeks before the national finals, Thornton asked Brandon to stay after computer science class. I heard about this conversation from Brandon that evening, and later, in fragmented pieces over the following months, I learned more details from students who'd been in the computer lab when parts of it occurred. Thornton had closed the classroom door and asked Brandon to sit down. His tone was serious, concerned. the way adults sound when they're about to deliver bad news they claim is for your own good. He told Brandon that he'd been reviewing the Innovation Challenge submission and had concerns. The project demonstrated capabilities that seemed beyond what a high school student could reasonably achieve without significant external assistance. The machine learning implementation in particular showed a sophistication that suggested either direct copying from existing code or substantial help from someone with professional expertise. Thornton wanted to know, for Brandon's own protection, whether he'd received help that he hadn't properly disclosed. Brandon explained, with the patience of someone who'd anticipated this conversation, that the project was entirely his own work. He offered to walk through the codebase line by line. He offered to explain every design decision. He pulled up his development logs, showing hundreds of hours of work. He referenced the documentation he'd compiled specifically to address this kind of question. But Thornton wasn't interested in evidence. He was building a narrative, and evidence that contradicted the narrative got reinterpreted as suspicious in itself. "Why would you need such extensive documentation?" Thornton asked, "unless you were trying to cover something up. Why would you create development logs after the fact? How could he verify that the timestamps weren't manipulated?" The questions came in a steady stream, each one framed as concern rather than accusation, but the implication was clear. Thornton had decided that Brandon's project wasn't authentically his own work, and no amount of evidence would change that conclusion. Brandon came home that afternoon, shaken in a way I'd never seen. He went straight to his room and sat at his computer without turning it on, just staring at the dark screens. When I asked what happened, he explained the conversation in a flat, controlled voice that worried me more than anger would have. Our mother came upstairs, and he repeated the story for her, and I watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and fear as the implications became clear. She asked the practical questions. What did Thornton want? What was he threatening to do? What were Brandon's options? Brandon didn't know. Thornton hadn't made any explicit demands. He just suggested that Brandon withdraw from the competition voluntarily, to avoid embarrassment when the questions about authenticity came up during judging. He'd positioned it as advice, as protection, as the action a concerned teacher would recommend to a student he cared about. But the threat underneath was obvious. If Brandon didn't withdraw, Thornton would take his concerns to the competition organizers. Our mother called the school the next morning and requested a meeting with Thornton and the principal. The meeting happened 2 days later. Our mother took Brandon out of school for it, and they spent 2 hours in the principal's office while I sat in algebra trying to focus on quadratic equations and failing completely. When they came home, the situation had somehow gotten worse. Thornton had come to the meeting prepared. He'd brought printed examples of similar projects from GitHub and academic papers, highlighting features that overlapped with Brandon's work. He acknowledged that overlap didn't prove copying, but combined with his professional judgment as a computer science teacher, it raised reasonable questions. He emphasized that he was only trying to protect the school's reputation and Brandon's future. If Brandon presented work that was later discovered to be inauthentic, it would destroy his credibility permanently. Better to address the concerns now, withdraw gracefully, and compete again next year with a project that was unquestionably original. The principal, a woman named Mrs. Prescott who'd been in the position for less than a year, tried to find middle ground. She suggested an independent review of the project by a third-party expert. Thornton agreed this was a reasonable approach, but questioned how they'd find someone truly independent, someone who wouldn't be biased in Brandon's favor. Our mother asked why the assumption was that bias would favor Brandon rather than supporting Thornton's predetermined conclusion. The conversation deteriorated from there. What emerged from that meeting was a stalemate with a ticking clock. Brandon could proceed with the competition, but Thornton reserved the right to submit his concerns to the organizers. Mrs. Prescott couldn't prevent Thornton from expressing his professional opinion. Our mother couldn't prove the accusations false because you can't prove a negative, and Brandon had 8 days before he needed to travel to the national finals in Boston. He decided to proceed. The alternative was giving up without fighting, and that wasn't in his nature. He spent the remaining week refining his presentation, anticipating every possible question about authenticity, preparing to defend not just his technical decisions, but his fundamental right to claim his own work. Our mother used savings she didn't have to buy plane tickets to Boston for both of them. I stayed home with our aunt, who flew in to watch me, and I spent those 3 days in a state of anxious suspension, waiting for news. The call came on the second day of the competition. Brandon had completed his presentation that morning. It had gone well. The judges had been impressed with both the technical implementation and the social application. They'd asked detailed questions, and he'd answered them confidently. Then, during lunch, one of the competition administrators had pulled him aside. They'd received communication from his school raising questions about the project's authenticity. They needed to investigate before they could proceed with judging his submission. He should enjoy the rest of the conference, but he shouldn't expect a decision in the timeline they'd originally provided. Our mother and Brandon flew home the next day. The house felt different when they returned, the air heavy with unspoken dread. Brandon went to his room and didn't come out except for meals. Our mother made phone calls, trying to reach the competition organizers, leaving messages that went unreturned. A week passed, then 2. The grant winners were announced without Brandon's name among them. The scholarship offers that several judges had mentioned informally never materialized into formal communications. Finally, an email arrived. The competition organizers thanked Brandon for his participation and informed him that after thorough review, they determined that questions about the project's authenticity couldn't be resolved to their satisfaction. While they weren't making any formal accusations, they felt it would be inappropriate to award recognition to work that carried such significant concerns. They encouraged him to continue his studies and perhaps participate again in future years with a project that could be more clearly documented as entirely original work. The email was bureaucratic and bloodless, but its effect was devastating. Brandon had built something remarkable, presented it successfully, impressed actual experts in the field, and still lost everything because a high school teacher had decided to destroy him. The grant money was gone. The scholarship opportunities were gone. The universities that had expressed interest went silent. Worse than any of that, his reputation was damaged in ways that would follow him. The organizers hadn't accused him of cheating explicitly, but their carefully worded statement implied it strongly enough that anyone who looked into his background would find it. I found him in his room that night, sitting in the dark. His computer was off. The development logs and documentation he'd so carefully compiled sat in a folder on his desk. Useless evidence that no one had cared to properly examine. I sat on his bed and waited, the way I always did when he needed time to process. "I'm going to have to get a full-time job," he said finally. "Mom can't carry this alone anymore. The colleges I was looking at aren't possible now anyway, not without the scholarship. I can do community college at night maybe, but we need money now. Real money, steady money." I tried to argue. I told him he could reapply to universities, explain what happened, show them his work. He shook his head. "No one's going to take the risk," he said. "Even if they believe me, which most won't, I'm a liability. A student with accusations of academic dishonesty in his background, even unproven accusations, isn't someone prestigious universities want to defend." Thornton knew that. He knew exactly what he was doing. That's when I made the promise, though I didn't speak it aloud. Sitting in my brother's darkened room, watching him accept the destruction of his future with the same systematic analysis he applied to everything, I promised myself that someday, somehow, Thornton would pay for this. I didn't know how. I was 12 years old with no power, no resources, no influence. But I made the promise anyway, and it settled into my chest like a coal that would burn slowly for years. The immediate aftermath was worse than the initial blow. Brandon graduated from Riverside High without ceremony, declining the various senior events and celebrations that held no meaning for him anymore. He took a job as a junior systems administrator at a local IT services company, work that was far below his capabilities but paid $40,000 a year with benefits. He gave most of his paycheck to our mother, keeping enough for gas and minimal personal expenses. He'd come home exhausted from managing computer systems for small businesses, eat dinner, mostly in silence, then disappear into his room where he'd work on personal projects until late in the night. I watched him age in ways that had nothing to do with years. The energy that had animated him, the excitement he'd brought to solving complex problems, dulled into something more mechanical. He still coded, still built things, but it was different now. He was filling time, maintaining skills, going through motions. The spark that had made him special had been systematically extinguished, and everyone who'd been involved in extinguishing it had moved on without consequence. Thornton continued teaching at Riverside High. His reputation as a demanding but dedicated educator remained intact. If anything, his standing improved. Word spread through the school's informal networks that he'd prevented a student from committing academic fraud at the national level, protecting the school's reputation. Parents heard he had high standards and wouldn't let students cut corners. His computer science classes stayed full. He continued sponsoring the coding club and organizing field trips. Students continued to see him as approachable and cool. I had him for Introduction to Computer Science during my freshman year, 2 years after he'd destroyed my brother. Sitting in his classroom, listening to him make jokes and explain basic programming concepts with enthusiastic patience, created a dissonance I struggled to process. This was the same person who'd methodically dismantled Brandon's future. The same person who'd made accusations he couldn't prove but wouldn't withdraw. The same person who'd positioned destruction as concern and called it teaching. But looking at him in front of the classroom, you'd never know. He was just Mr. Thornton, the computer science teacher who stayed late to help students and brought enthusiasm to a subject many teenagers found intimidating. I kept my head down in his class. I did the assignments competently, but not exceptionally. I never asked questions that would draw attention. I made myself forgettable, just another student moving through his curriculum without distinction. When he'd make comments about academic integrity, about the importance of doing your own work, about how shortcuts always caught up with you eventually, I'd feel that coal in my chest burn hotter. But I said nothing. I was 15 years old. I had no power. Confronting him would accomplish nothing except making me a target. Meanwhile, our family stabilized into a new configuration that felt nothing like our life before. Our mother stopped working extra hours because Brandon's income made them unnecessary. The careful budget management continued, but the desperate edge was gone. We could pay bills on time. We could handle unexpected expenses without crisis. The margins had returned, but they'd been purchased with Brandon's future, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it directly. Brandon dated occasionally, half-hearted attempts at normal social interaction that never developed into anything serious. He'd meet someone at work or through friends. They'd go out a few times, and then it would fade without drama or explanation. I think the problem was that he couldn't let people get close enough to matter. The betrayal he'd experienced had taught him that institutions and authorities couldn't be trusted, but it had also taught him something more corrosive, that no matter how carefully you built something, no matter how much you deserved recognition, someone could destroy it on a whim if they had the right position and the wrong motivations. That knowledge made intimacy feel dangerous. Better to keep people at a distance where they couldn't do real damage. I graduated from middle school and moved to Riverside High myself, walking the same halls Brandon had walked, sitting in some of the same classrooms. Teachers who remembered him would occasionally make comments, usually well-intentioned, about how bright he'd been, how they'd expected him to do remarkable things. I'd nod and say nothing. What could I say? That he was doing remarkable things, just not the ones they'd imagined? That he was keeping our family afloat with work that bored him? That their colleague had destroyed his trajectory and they'd done nothing to stop it? During my sophomore year, Thornton was promoted to department chair for technology and mathematics. The promotion came with a modest salary increase and expanded responsibilities. He'd impressed the administration with his dedication and high standards. He'd brought new curriculum materials into the computer science program. He'd increased enrollment in advanced classes. He was exactly the kind of teacher the school wanted to retain and elevate. Watching him succeed while Brandon stagnated felt like watching someone get rewarded for arson. I started paying attention to Thornton's life outside school in ways that probably weren't healthy. I learned he was married to a woman named Erica, who I'd see occasionally at school events. She was a few years younger than him, energetic and friendly, the kind of person who seemed to genuinely enjoy meeting people. They had a son, a kid named Tyler, who was 3 years younger than me, smart and athletic in the easy way some people are, the kind of student who excelled without apparent effort. Thornton would mention them sometimes during class, small anecdotes about family life that were probably meant to make him seem relatable. I'd listen and catalog every detail, not knowing what I'd do with the information, but collecting it anyway. Erica ran some kind of educational center, though the details weren't clear to me at the time. Thornton mentioned it occasionally, proud that she was building her own business, helping students prepare for standardized tests and college applications. It sounded like a small operation, the kind of thing that supplemented their household income without being a primary source. But it bothered me that they were building wealth and stability and success on a foundation that included destroying my brother. They were thriving while Brandon worked 60-hour weeks at a job that required a fraction of his capabilities. Meanwhile, I was developing my own skills, though they were different from Brandon's. I was good at school in a way that had less to do with pure intelligence and more to do with understanding systems and people. I could read teachers, figure out what they wanted, deliver it efficiently. I played baseball well enough to make varsity as a sophomore, which gave me social capital and connections. I was friendly without being close to anyone, helpful without being indispensable, visible without being memorable. I was building a different kind of competence than Brandon's technical mastery, and I was doing it consciously, understanding even then that different forms of power required different skill sets. Brandon noticed. We didn't talk about it directly, but I'd catch him watching me sometimes. A strange expression on his face that might have been approval or might have been concern. He'd ask about school, about baseball, about my friends, and I'd give him edited versions that highlighted my strategic thinking without making it sound calculating. He never offered advice about this approach to life, but he never discouraged it either. I think he understood that I was preparing for something, building capabilities that would matter eventually, even if neither of us could articulate what that eventual use might be. During my junior year, something shifted. Brandon started coming home later from work, and when I asked about it, he mentioned he'd been taking evening classes at the community college, working toward an associate degree in computer science. It seemed like a waste given his expertise, but he explained it wasn't about learning new material. It was about having formal credentials, documented proof of knowledge that institutions recognized. He was systematically filling in the gaps that Thornton's sabotage had created, building a foundation he could defend. He also started taking on freelance projects, small programming jobs he'd find through online platforms, building websites for local businesses, creating custom software for niche applications, solving specific problems for clients who found him through word of mouth. The money was inconsistent, but sometimes substantial, and he was building a portfolio of work that demonstrated his capabilities to anyone willing to look. He'd work his full-time job, attend evening classes twice a week, then spend late nights on freelance projects, sleeping 4 or 5 hours before starting the cycle again. I asked him why he was pushing himself so hard. We were financially stable. Our mother didn't need his entire paycheck anymore. He could ease up, have some kind of life outside of work and study. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I'm not done building yet," he said. "This is just the foundation. What I build on top of it is going to matter." I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but I recognized the determination in his voice. It was different from the desperate energy that had driven him during high school. This was colder, more calculated, more patient. He wasn't racing toward a goal anymore. He was constructing something methodically, piece by piece, without announcing his intentions or seeking validation. He'd learned from his first attempt. This time, he wasn't going to make the mistake of becoming visible before he was untouchable. I graduated from high school with strong grades and solid baseball statistics, good enough to attract attention from small colleges but not enough for significant athletic scholarships. Brandon encouraged me to think seriously about what I wanted to study, what skills would give me leverage in the world. I'd always been good with numbers, good at understanding how resources moved between people and institutions. He suggested I consider economics or finance, fields that would teach me to see the structures underlying power. I applied to several state universities with good business programs, eventually accepting a place at Central State, a respectable mid-tier school about 3 hours from home. Before I left for college, Brandon and I had a conversation that redefined our relationship. We were in his room, now less cluttered than it had been in high school, but still centered around his computer setup. He'd been working on something for months, a project he hadn't discussed in detail, and that night he finally showed me what he'd built. It was a platform for connecting freelance programmers with clients, but it was sophisticated in ways that went beyond typical marketplace sites. The matching algorithm accounted for technical expertise, communication style, deadline reliability, and dozens of other variables. The interface was clean and intuitive. The back end was robust and scalable. It was exactly the kind of thing that could actually succeed if launched properly. The kind of thing that demonstrated the same capabilities that had impressed judges at the Innovation Challenge years earlier. "I'm not going to launch this yet," he said. "I'm going to keep building features, keep refining the algorithm, keep making it better, and I'm going to save money. Every freelance dollar I don't need for bills, every bonus from my day job, every extra dollar I can generate goes into savings. When I finally launch this, I want enough capital to do it properly, to market it effectively, to compete seriously." "How long?" I asked. 3 years minimum," he said, "maybe 5. However long it takes to build both the product and the resources to support it properly. I'm not racing anymore. I'm not entering competitions or seeking validation from institutions that can take it away on a whim. I'm building something that can't be sabotaged because it won't depend on anyone's approval except the market's." "And then what?" I asked. "Then we see what happens when someone can't kill what you've built just because they feel like it," he said. I understood then that Brandon hadn't given up on his future. He'd just recalibrated his timeline and approach. The betrayal he'd experienced had taught him to build differently, to create power structures that couldn't be dismantled by institutional authority because they existed outside institutional frameworks. He was going to prove, methodically and without drama, that Thornton had been wrong, that his work was authentic and valuable, that he could succeed without permission from anyone who'd tried to stop him. I went to Central State University that fall with a new sense of purpose. My role was evolving. I wasn't just Brandon's younger brother anymore. I was becoming his partner in something larger, though we hadn't defined it explicitly. My job was to learn what he couldn't, to develop different capabilities, to understand how money and influence and power operated in contexts he didn't have access to. He was building technical competence and entrepreneurial capability. I would build financial literacy and strategic intelligence. Together, we'd create something that wouldn't depend on any single person's approval or institutional validation. I declared a major in finance and a minor in economics, throwing myself into the coursework with focus that surprised my professors. I joined the investment club, learning how markets worked and how to analyze companies. I took extra courses in accounting, understanding that money was just information, and whoever read that information best had advantages others didn't see. I networked deliberately, making connections with students who came from wealth and with professors who had experience in banking and private equity. I was building a foundation of knowledge and relationships, the same way Brandon was building technical expertise and freelance reputation. During winter break of my freshman year, I came home to find Brandon had made significant progress. His freelance income had grown to the point where it sometimes exceeded his day job salary. His community college degree was complete, and he'd been accepted to finish his bachelor's at a state university that offered night programs for working professionals. His platform was feature complete and had been tested extensively with a small group of beta users. He had $40,000 saved, a number that represented years of ruthless financial discipline and every spare dollar he could generate. We sat in his room, and he walked me through his plans. He was going to launch the platform in 6 months. He'd continue his day job for stability, but reduce his hours, if possible. He'd use his savings to fund initial marketing and to smooth out cash flow in the early months. He expected the first year to be brutal, 16-hour days of development and customer support, and iterating based on feedback. But if it worked, if the platform found its market, it could generate real revenue within 18 months, and potentially become something significant within 5 years. And if it works, I asked, what then? Then we have options we don't have now, he said. Money creates leverage. Success creates credibility. Once we have both, we can choose what to do with them. That was the first time he'd said we instead of I when talking about his future. I'd been included in the plan not as a dependent brother, but as a partner, someone with a role to play in whatever came next. I understood then that the promise I'd made to myself years earlier, sitting in his darkened room after the competition results came through, wasn't just my promise. It was ours. We'd never discussed it explicitly, never made it a formal plan, but we both knew. Someday, when we had the resources and the position, Thornton would understand what he'd done. The years that followed were marked by incremental progress that felt invisible day to day, but added up to fundamental transformation. Brandon launched his platform, called Code Connect, in the summer after my freshman year. The first 6 months were exactly as brutal as he'd predicted. The initial marketing spend brought modest user acquisition. Technical issues required constant attention. Early reviews were mixed, praising the matching algorithm while criticizing gaps in the interface. Brandon fixed every complaint, added every requested feature, responded personally to every piece of feedback. Slowly, the platform found traction. By the end of the first year, Code Connect had 1,500 active freelancers and generated enough revenue to cover its operating costs, plus a small profit. By the end of the second year, it had grown to over 5,000 freelancers and was generating 6 figures in annual revenue. Brandon quit his day job and hired 2 junior developers to help manage the code base. He finished his bachelor's degree, not because he needed the credential anymore, but because he'd committed to completing it. He moved out of our mother's house into a modest apartment near campus, paying rent that felt extravagant compared to living at home, but represented independence he'd earned. I graduated from Central State with honors and a job offer from a regional investment firm, a small operation that managed money for wealthy individuals and small institutions. The salary was competitive for an entry-level position, and more importantly, The work gave me direct exposure to how significant capital moved and multiplied. I learned to analyze companies, to identify undervalued opportunities, to understand the difference between actual value and market perception. I learned how to read financial statements the way Brandon read code, seeing the underlying structure and logic that numbers represented. During my second year at the firm, I approached Brandon with a proposal. Code Connect was growing steadily and generating healthy profits, but it could grow faster with strategic investment. He'd been bootstrapping entirely, reinvesting all profits back into the business, which was admirable but limiting. If he was willing to accept an outside investor, someone who understood his vision and wouldn't try to control his decisions, he could accelerate growth significantly. I had $12,000 saved, a number that represented every dollar I hadn't spent on anything except absolute necessities since starting work. I offered it to him in exchange for a small equity stake, positioned not as a loan but as genuine investment. I believed in what he'd built, I said, and I wanted to be part of it, not just as his brother, but as a true partner. Brandon considered the offer for 2 days, then accepted with terms more generous than I'd proposed. He gave me a 5% equity stake, structured the agreement formally with legal documentation, and treated me with the same seriousness he'd treat any professional investor. The money allowed him to hire 2 more developers and invest in marketing campaigns that expanded Code Connect's user base significantly. Within a year, the platform had grown to 15,000 active freelancers and was generating over $500,000 in annual revenue. More importantly, the investment changed our relationship in ways that mattered beyond the financial. We became true business partners, meeting regularly to discuss strategy and growth and long-term planning. I'd bring insights from my work at the investment firm, patterns I'd noticed in how successful companies scaled and failed companies stagnated. He'd bring technical expertise and deep understanding of the freelance market. Together, we'd synthesize these perspectives into decisions that proved sound more often than not. We also started talking explicitly about what came next, the conversation we'd been circling around for years without naming directly. Code Connect was successful and growing, but it wasn't the ultimate goal. It was capital accumulation, proof of concept, demonstration of capabilities. What we really wanted to build was something larger, something that would give us not just money, but influence. The kind of power that couldn't be taken away by someone in a position of institutional authority. I suggested we start an investment fund, a small operation initially, focused on providing capital to early-stage companies in exchange for equity. We had the capital now, between Code Connect's profits and our personal savings. We had the expertise, Brandon's technical knowledge, combined with my financial training. We had the network, connections I'd built through my firm, and connections Brandon had built through Code Connect. What we needed was structure and execution. We spent 6 months researching, learning about fund management and securities law and investor relations. We consulted with lawyers and accountants, setting up the legal structures properly from the start. We developed an investment thesis focused on early-stage software companies with technical founders, the kind of businesses we actually understood and could add value to beyond just providing capital. We named it Apex Ventures, a name that sounded professional without being pretentious. Our first fund was small, just $400,000, most of it our own money, with modest contributions from a few individuals who'd invested in Code Connect and trusted our judgment. We made our first investment in a company building project management software for construction companies, a boring but necessary tool with clear revenue potential. The investment was $25,000 for 8% equity, structured with standard terms we'd learned from studying other funds' documentation. The company grew steadily, eventually getting acquired by a larger software company 3 years later. Our stake returned $85,000, more than triple our initial investment. That success made the second fund easier to raise. We secured commitments for nearly $2 million, this time including capital from family offices and high net worth individuals who'd heard about our first fund's performance. We were building credibility in a world that ran on credibility, establishing ourselves as serious operators rather than lucky amateurs. By this point, I was 26 years old and Brandon was 31. We'd been building methodically for nearly a decade since the Innovation Challenge disaster, accumulating capital and expertise and connections without announcing our intentions or seeking recognition. Code Connect was generating over $2 million in annual revenue. Apex Ventures had deployed most of its second fund across 12 investments, several of which were showing strong growth. We'd moved from survival to stability to genuine success, and we'd done it entirely outside the institutional frameworks that had failed us. Our mother had retired from teaching, her pension modest but sufficient because we made sure it was. We'd paid off the mortgage on the house where we'd grown up, the house our father's departure had threatened, giving her security she'd never had during our childhood. She'd ask sometimes what exactly we were building, and we'd give her simple explanations that didn't capture the full scope. "We're doing well, Mom. We're building something that matters." She'd look at us with an expression that mixed pride with something that might have been concern, but she never pushed for details we weren't ready to share. It was during this period that we started paying attention to Thornton's life again, deliberately and systematically. He'd continued advancing at Riverside High, eventually becoming assistant principal while maintaining his teaching responsibilities. His wife Erica's educational center had grown substantially, operating out of a dedicated facility and employing several tutors. Their son Tyler was excelling at a prestigious private high school, already being recruited by elite universities for both academics and athletics. The family had moved to a larger house in a better neighborhood. They took vacations to Europe. They drove new cars. They projected the comfortable success of people who'd built their life properly and reaped the rewards. I hired a discreet research firm to compile information, framing it as due diligence for a potential business relationship. What came back was detailed and illuminating. Erica's educational center, registered under her name, received significant funding through state grants designed to support educational initiatives in underserved communities. The grants required detailed reporting on how funds were used, documentation of student outcomes, verification that services actually reached the intended populations. The firm's research suggested that the reported metrics were likely inflated. Student counts seemed higher than facility capacity would support. Reported outcomes showed success rates that didn't match independent testing data. Contracts with vendors appeared to be structured in ways that channeled money through multiple entities before reaching final recipients, a pattern often used to obscure actual spending. Nothing was explicitly illegal based on what we could verify externally, but the structure raised questions that regulatory scrutiny would likely find interesting. More detailed investigation revealed that Thornton himself had been instrumental in securing these grants, using his position as an educator and administrator to advocate for his wife's center. He'd written letters of recommendation, sat on review boards, leveraged his professional reputation to support applications. Again, nothing explicitly improper, but the intersection of his public position and her private benefit created ethical ambiguities that formal review might interpret unfavorably. Their son Tyler was preparing to apply to Cambridge University, targeting their computer science program, one of the most competitive in the world. The application process was intense and required substantial family resources for preparation, test fees, and visits. The family was investing everything into positioning him for success, the kind of comprehensive support that wealthy families could provide, and that Brandon had never had access to. Brandon and I reviewed all of this information together in his apartment, spreading documents across his dining table, analyzing it with the same systematic approach we applied to investment opportunities. The research had cost us $5,000, a trivial amount now, but still significant enough to signal this was serious. We weren't indulging curiosity, we were building a case. The question isn't whether we can hurt them, Brandon said finally. The question is whether we should. I understood the distinction. We had the resources now to cause serious problems for Thornton's family. We could file complaints with the organizations that provided grants to Erica's center. We could leak information to journalists who covered educational funding. We could create difficulties that would take years to resolve, regardless of whether formal wrongdoing could be proven. The process itself would be the punishment, the investigation and scrutiny and defense that consumed resources and attention and peace of mind. But Brandon wasn't sure he wanted to do that. He'd spent years building something meaningful, creating actual value, helping freelancers find work and companies find talent. Code Connect and Apex Ventures weren't about revenge. They were about proving that he could succeed, despite the sabotage, that Thornton's accusations had been not just false, but irrelevant to his ultimate trajectory. Maybe success itself was enough. Maybe the best revenge was building something Thornton could never touch or diminish, and living well. I listened to him work through this reasoning and understood it intellectually, but I also remembered sitting in his darkened room when we were teenagers, watching him accept the destruction of his future with quiet devastation, making that promise to myself that someday there would be consequences. 10 years had passed. We'd built exactly the kind of power and resources we'd needed to build. The opportunity was in front of us, and Brandon was considering letting it pass because he'd transcended the need for revenge. I respected that transcendence, but I also knew something he didn't quite acknowledge, something I'd learned during my years studying how power actually functioned in the world. Letting powerful people escape consequences for their actions didn't ennoble you. It just enabled them to continue operating with impunity, to damage other people the way they damaged you, to believe that their position protected them from accountability. Thornton had faced no consequences for destroying a student's future because he felt like it. If we didn't change that calculation, we'd be complicit in whatever he did next. I made this argument to Brandon carefully, framing it not as revenge, but as accountability. We had evidence that Erica's center was likely misusing public funds. Those funds were intended to help students who needed support. Students like we'd been. Students whose families didn't have resources to pay for expensive test prep. If the money wasn't reaching those students, if it was being siphoned into the Thornton family's comfortable life, then exposing that wasn't revenge. It was just making sure public resources went where they were supposed to go. Brandon considered this for several days. Finally, he asked what I thought we should do specifically. What actions would accomplish the goal without crossing lines we shouldn't cross? I'd been thinking about this since the research came back, and I had a plan that felt both effective and defensible. First, we'd file formal complaints with the organizations that provided grants, detailed and well-documented, raising specific questions about reporting discrepancies and requesting full audits. We'd do this anonymously through lawyers, protecting ourselves while ensuring the complaints got proper attention. Second, we'd use our connections in the business community to quietly mention concerns about the center's practices to people who sat on relevant oversight boards. Nothing accusatory, just questions that encouraged those people to look closer. Third, we'd wait. Once proper scrutiny began, either the center was clean and would survive investigation, or it wasn't and wouldn't. We wouldn't determine the outcome. We'd just ensure the questions got asked that should have been asked years ago. Brandon agreed to this approach with one modification. If the investigation revealed actual wrongdoing, if Erica's center was genuinely misusing funds, then he wanted us to be positioned to acquire the center's debts when it collapsed. Not to forgive them, not to help, but to own their obligations, to become the entity they owed money to to make sure they understood that their comfortable life had been built on foundations we could collapse whenever we decided the time was right. I made the first filings through our law firm in early November, detailed complaints that referenced specific grant applications and reporting documents. The organizations that provided the funding had to respond to formal complaints with documented review, a process that could take months but would involve detailed audits of the center's finances and operations. We ensured copies of the complaints reached oversight boards and local journalists who covered educational funding issues. The response began in December. The state education department announced routine audits of several grant-funded programs, including Erica's Center. Media coverage was minimal initially, just brief mentions in local news about normal oversight processes. But the investigation itself was real. Auditors requested comprehensive financial records. They interviewed current and former students. They verified that reported outcomes matched independent testing data. They examined vendor contracts and payment records. By March, problems were emerging. The audits revealed systematic discrepancies between reported student numbers and actual attendance. They found contracts with vendors owned by family members at prices above market rates. They discovered that funds designated for scholarships to low-income students had been used for general operating expenses, including salaries for family members who performed vaguely defined administrative roles. Nothing quite reached the threshold of criminal fraud, but it was more than enough for civil regulatory violations. The state education department froze future grant payments, pending resolution of the audit findings. The organizations that had provided past grants demanded repayment of misused funds. The private school that had been sending students to the center for test preparation suspended their relationship pending investigation outcomes. Within weeks, Erica's Center was facing demands for repayment totaling over $300,000, with no incoming revenue to service those obligations. I monitored all of this through our lawyers and through business contacts who sat on relevant boards. Brandon stayed removed from the direct information flow, receiving updates from me, but not personally involving himself in the investigative process. We were careful to maintain plausible separation, ensuring nothing could trace back to us as the source of the original complaints. We were just concerned citizens who'd noticed irregularities and reported them through proper channels. In June, Erica's Center formally ceased operations. The debts were sold to a collection agency for pennies on the dollar, standard practice when an entity couldn't pay and had no assets worth seizing. We approached the collection agency through intermediaries and purchased the debt package for $45,000, less than 15 cents on each dollar owed. The agency was happy to sell and move on. We were now the legal owners of obligations the Thornton family couldn't pay. The wider implications rippled out from there. The private academy, where Thornton had become assistant principal, launched its own investigation into whether he'd used his position improperly to benefit his wife's center. They found enough concerning connections, including recommendation letters he'd written, supporting grant applications, and his presence on review boards that evaluated those applications, to create serious ethical questions. While they couldn't prove explicit quid pro quo, the appearance of impropriety was sufficient. The board asked for his resignation as assistant principal, allowing him to remain as a teacher to avoid the scandal of termination, but removing him from administrative authority. The media coverage expanded as the full scope emerged. Local newspapers ran stories about grant misuse and conflicts of interest. Education blogs picked up the narrative as an example of how oversight failures allowed public funds to be diverted. Thornton's name appeared repeatedly, not as a criminal, but as someone whose judgment and ethics raised serious questions. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was being dismantled in the same way he'd dismantled Brandon's, with implications and questions that didn't require proof to cause permanent damage. The final blow came from Cambridge University. Tyler's application had been strong, and he'd received a conditional offer for admission pending final exam results. But Cambridge, like all elite universities, monitored media coverage of admitted students and their families, watching for controversies that might reflect poorly on the institution. The investigation into grant misuse, the ethical questions around Thornton's role, the media narrative about conflicts of interest, all created exactly the kind of liability elite universities avoided. In August, Cambridge withdrew Tyler's admission offer, citing concerns about the integrity of his family's financial disclosures and the investigation outcomes. The Thornton family, in the span of 9 months, had lost Erica's center, the supplemental income it provided, Thornton's administrative position and associated salary increase, their reputation in the community, and their son's admission to his dream university. They'd gone from comfortable success to defensive crisis management, from projecting confidence to struggling with obligations they couldn't meet and consequences they couldn't escape. It was in October, almost a year after we'd filed the initial complaints, that Thornton reached out to Brandon. The message came through LinkedIn, a platform Thornton probably chose because it seemed professional rather than personal. The message was carefully worded, acknowledging that time had passed and situations had changed, expressing hope that they could have a conversation about resolving outstanding issues in a way that would benefit everyone involved. Brandon showed me the message without commenting on it. I could see him working through the calculation, trying to decide whether engaging served any purpose. Finally, he responded with a brief message, suggesting they meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, the following Saturday morning. Thornton agreed immediately, probably reading hope into the willingness to meet. I suggested I should come to that meeting, but Brandon said no. This conversation, whatever it turned out to be, needed to happen between the two of them. I could wait nearby if he wanted backup available, but the actual discussion was his to conduct. I understood and didn't push. I drove him to the coffee shop and parked down the street, waiting while he went inside. He told me about the conversation afterward, sitting in the car before I drove us home. Thornton had arrived early, already at a table, when Brandon walked in. He looked older than Brandon remembered, the years and stress showing in ways that went beyond simple aging. He stood when Brandon approached, offered his hand, which Brandon took briefly before sitting down. Thornton started with pleasantries, asking about Brandon's work, commenting that he'd heard good things about Code Connect, expressing admiration that Brandon had built a successful company despite everything that had happened. Brandon listened without responding, letting Thornton fill the silence with increasingly nervous observations. Finally, Thornton got to the actual purpose of the meeting. He acknowledged that things had become difficult for his family. The investigation into his wife's center had revealed problems he claimed he hadn't known about. Financial management issues that Erica had handled without his involvement. He'd lost his administrative position as a consequence, which was painful but understandable, given the appearance of impropriety. His son had lost his university admission, which was devastating, and felt disproportionate to whatever minor mistakes might have been made. They were facing financial obligations they couldn't meet, debts that had been sold to collectors, and he'd discovered that those debts were now owned by an entity connected to Brandon. He wanted to know what it would take to resolve this. He understood that Brandon might have feelings about what happened in high school, that the innovation challenge situation might have seemed unfair from Brandon's perspective. But surely after all these years, and with Brandon's obvious success, there could be some way to move forward. He was willing to apologize formally if that would help. He was willing to write letters supporting Brandon's work, to make public statements correcting the record. He was asking, as one person who'd made mistakes to another, for the opportunity to make things right. Brandon had listened to all of this in silence. When Thornton finished, Brandon took a long breath before responding. He said he appreciated Thornton taking the time to meet, but there was nothing to resolve. The debts were legitimate obligations that the Thornton family had incurred through their own choices. The investigation had been conducted by proper authorities, following appropriate procedures. The consequences were the natural results of actions taken over many years. None of this had anything to do with Brandon personally, and therefore Brandon had no power to change any of it. Thornton started to protest, to insist that Brandon must have some influence, that the timing couldn't be coincidental, that surely there was something Brandon wanted that could make this go away. Brandon cut him off with a raised hand. He explained, in the same patient tone he'd once used to teach me about programming concepts, that Thornton seemed to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. He seemed to think this was about revenge, about Brandon punishing him for something that happened years ago. But it wasn't. It was about accountability. Thornton had used his position to destroy a student's future because he felt like it, because he could, because there were no consequences for abusing institutional authority. He'd then watched that student's life contract to full-time work supporting his family, while Thornton himself thrived and advanced and built comfortable success. He'd never apologized, never acknowledged wrongdoing, never faced any cost for what he'd done. The current situation, Brandon explained, was just that cost arriving late. The investigation into grant misuse happened because the grant misuse actually occurred. The loss of Thornton's administrative position happened because he'd actually created improper conflicts of interest. Tyler's admission being withdrawn happened because universities actually care about the ethical standing of admitted students' families. All of this was real consequence for real actions, not revenge, but simply accountability that Thornton should have faced years ago. As for the debts, Brandon said, those would remain in place. The collection efforts would continue following normal legal processes. If Thornton could pay them, he should. If he couldn't, the consequences for unpaid debts would follow their normal course. Brandon wouldn't forgive them, wouldn't reduce them, wouldn't accept payment plans more favorable than what any other debtor would receive. The debts existed because the obligations existed. That was all there was to it. Thornton tried one more approach. He asked about Tyler, about whether Brandon could at least help protect his son from consequences for problems Tyler hadn't created. Tyler was just a kid who'd worked hard and earned his admission legitimately. He shouldn't have to pay for his parents' mistakes. Brandon's response to this was the coldest thing he said in the entire conversation. He told Thornton that he'd been a kid too, a kid who'd worked hard and earned his recognition legitimately, but he'd paid for his teacher's choices anyway, paid with his scholarship and his university admission, and his entire future trajectory. If Tyler lost his Cambridge admission because of his family's choices, that was unfortunate, but it wasn't Brandon's responsibility to fix. Tyler would find another university, would build another future, would probably be fine, just like Brandon had been. The difference, Brandon said, was that now Thornton would understand how it felt to watch your child's future shrink because of someone else's choices. Now he'd understand what it meant when institutional power got used to destroy opportunity because someone in authority felt like it. Now he'd experience firsthand the helplessness of being unable to protect someone you cared about from consequences that seemed disproportionate but were nevertheless real. Thornton sat in silence for a long moment after that. Then he asked very quietly if there was anything he could do, anything at all, that would earn Brandon's forgiveness and make this stop. Brandon stood up to leave. He looked down at Thornton, this man who'd once held so much power over his life, now small and desperate and begging for mercy from someone he'd crushed without thought. He said that forgiveness wasn't his to grant because Thornton hadn't wronged him personally. Thornton had wronged the institution of education, the principle of fairness, the idea that authority carries responsibility. Those abstractions couldn't forgive him. The current consequences weren't punishment Brandon was inflicting. They were just the natural results of Thornton's choices catching up to him. And if that felt unfair, if the timing felt suspicious, if the scope felt disproportionate, then Thornton now understood exactly what he'd put Brandon through years ago. Brandon walked out without saying goodbye, leaving Thornton sitting alone at that coffee shop table. He said the last image he had was of Thornton with his head in his hands, the reality finally settling in that nothing he could offer, no apology or promise or plea, would change anything. The time for those gestures had been years ago. Now it was just too late. We drove home in silence. I asked eventually if he felt better, if having that confrontation provided the satisfaction he'd imagined. He thought about it before answering. He said it didn't feel like he'd imagined because he hadn't imagined anything. He'd spent years building capabilities and resources, but he'd never actually visualized this moment, never rehearsed what he'd say or how it would feel. The satisfaction, such as it was, came from knowing that Thornton finally understood consequences existed, that authority didn't protect you from accountability, that actions eventually caught up with you even if it took years. But there was also something hollow about it. Thornton's suffering didn't undo what had happened to Brandon. It didn't restore the years he'd lost or the future that had been taken from him. It just meant someone else now understood that same loss. The evening of the scales didn't create justice. It just distributed injustice more widely. I asked if he regretted what we'd done. He shook his head. No, he said. They deserved accountability. The grant misuse was real. The conflicts of interest were real. The consequences were appropriate to the actions. I don't regret making sure those consequences happened. But I also recognize that this doesn't fix anything. It just closes the loop. Over the following months, we maintained our distance from the Thornton family situation. The collection efforts for their debts proceeded through normal legal channels, garnishing wages and seizing available assets, but not pushing them into bankruptcy or homelessness. We'd calibrated the pressure carefully, making their life difficult but not impossible, ensuring they experience real consequence without destroying them completely. Thornton remained employed at Riverside High as a regular teacher, his salary reduced from his administrative position but still sufficient for basic needs. Erica took a job at a private tutoring company, working for someone else rather than running her own center. Tyler enrolled at a good state university instead of Cambridge, his academic future constrained but not eliminated. The family moved to a smaller house. They drove older cars. They stopped taking international vacations. Their life contracted to something that resembled how we'd lived after our father left, comfortable enough to avoid crisis but without margins for error or indulgence. I suggested to Brandon that we could release the debts now, that we'd made our point and continuing to extract payment was unnecessary. He considered this briefly, then declined. Releasing the debts would be a gesture of forgiveness I don't feel, and superiority I don't need to demonstrate, he said. The debts exist because the obligations exist. They'll continue to exist until they're paid, or until the legal processes resolve them naturally. I'm not going to forgive them any more than I'm going to intensify collection efforts. I'm just going to let them remain, a permanent reminder that consequences exist even when they arrive late. Code Connect continued growing, expanding into international markets and diversifying into adjacent services. Apex Ventures raised its third fund, over $10 million this time, and developed a reputation as a sophisticated early-stage investor with strong technical diligence and founder-friendly terms. Brandon finished his bachelor's degree and was accepted into a selective MBA program, not because he needed the credential, but because he'd decided he wanted the formal education he'd been denied years earlier. I got promoted at my investment firm, eventually making partner and managing a significant portfolio of client assets. We'd built exactly what we'd set out to build, power and resources and capabilities, that couldn't be taken away by institutional authority because they existed independent of any single institution's approval. We'd proven that Thornton's accusations had been false, and that Brandon's work had always been authentic and valuable. We'd achieved success that was objectively superior to anything Thornton had accomplished. Wealth and influence and respect that his teaching salary and administrative positions could never match. But the cost of that achievement was written in the person Brandon had become. The brother I'd known in high school, the one who got excited about elegant algorithms and explained complex concepts with patient enthusiasm, was still there but buried under layers of calculation and control. He didn't get excited about projects anymore. He evaluated them. He didn't trust easily or share freely. He maintained careful distance from everyone except our mother and me, even in his closest professional relationships. I'd changed too, though I recognized it less clearly. The systematic way I approached everything, the constant evaluation of power dynamics and leverage, the inability to accept anything at face value without analyzing its underlying structure, these were all adaptations to the lesson I'd learned watching Brandon's future get destroyed. The lesson that the world didn't reward merit or fairness, that institutions and authorities couldn't be trusted, that security came only from building power that existed independent of anyone's approval. We'd won. We'd achieved revenge or accountability or whatever label felt appropriate for making sure Thornton faced consequences for his actions. We'd built successful companies and generated wealth and established ourselves as serious operators in our respective fields. We'd protected our mother and given her security she'd never had. We'd proven that we could succeed despite sabotage, that we could build things that mattered, that we could turn early destruction into eventual triumph. But sitting in Brandon's apartment late one night, both of us working on our respective projects in comfortable silence, I looked at him and saw something that bothered me. He was 34 years old, financially secure, professionally successful, objectively impressive by any external measure. But he was alone, not just single, though he was that too, but alone in a deeper sense. He'd built walls so high that no one could get close enough to hurt him again, and those same walls prevented anyone from getting close enough to matter. I asked him if he was happy. The question came out of nowhere, interrupting our work rhythm, and he looked up from his laptop with surprise. Happy, he repeated, like the word required translation. I don't know. Am I supposed to be? Most people want to be, I said. He considered this for a long moment before responding. I'm satisfied, he finally said. I built what I set out to build. I achieved what I needed to achieve. I made sure the person who destroyed my future faced consequences for doing it. Those are accomplishments that matter more to me than happiness, whatever that means. But would you do it differently, I asked, if you could go back? Knowing what it would cost, would you still choose this path? He didn't answer immediately, and I could see him actually working through the question rather than dismissing it. Finally, he spoke quietly. I don't think I had a choice, he said. Once Thornton destroyed my future, once I understood how institutional authority could be abused without consequence, I couldn't just move on and pretend it didn't matter. I had to build something that couldn't be taken away. I had to make sure he faced accountability. I had to prove that his accusations were false and that I could succeed anyway. Those weren't choices. They were necessities. But necessity doesn't mean absence of cost, I said. No, he agreed, it doesn't. I'm aware of what I lost. I'm aware that I'm not the person I would have been if none of this had happened. I'm aware that the drive that built Code Connect and Apex Ventures came from trauma rather than passion, that I spent my 20s proving a point rather than exploring possibilities. I'm aware of all of that. He paused, looking at his laptop screen without seeing it. But I'm also aware that the alternative was accepting destruction without response, that letting Thornton face no consequences would have been worse than whatever I lost by ensuring he did. So if the question is whether I'd choose differently, the answer is no. This was the only path I could take and still live with myself. I understood what he meant, because I felt versions of the same thing. The promise I'd made to myself as a 12-year-old, sitting in his darkened room, had shaped everything I'd done since. The finance degree, the investment firm job, the networking and skill building, and systematic accumulation of capabilities, all of it had been in service of a goal I'd never explicitly stated but never forgotten. We'd achieved that goal. We'd built power and used it and made sure justice arrived even if it arrived late. But in achieving it, we'd also proved something we'd never wanted to prove, that Thornton had permanently changed us, that his betrayal had defined our trajectory as much as our own choices had, that we'd spent our entire adult lives responding to something that happened when we were teenagers. We'd won the confrontation but lost something essential in the process of winning, some capacity for trust or joy or spontaneity that we'd never recover. The Thornton family continued living their constrained life. Harrison teaching his computer science classes without enthusiasm. Erica working at her tutoring job without authority. Tyler attending his state university with the knowledge that his dream school was gone because of his parents' choices. They experienced consequence daily, in small ways and large, and they knew we'd been responsible for initiating that consequence, even if they couldn't prove it. But knowing didn't help them. Understanding that we'd filed the complaints and triggered the investigations and positioned ourselves to own their debts didn't change anything. They still owed the money. The investigation findings were still legitimate. The consequences were still appropriate to their actions. We'd been careful to ensure everything happened through proper channels, that every step was legally and ethically defensible, that the accountability came from institutions rather than from us directly. We were just concerned citizens who noticed irregularities and reported them. Everything after that was just systems working as they were designed to work. Years passed. Code Connect got acquired by a larger platform for $35 million, a number that represented validation of everything Brandon had built, and a financial outcome that secured our mother's future and ours indefinitely. Apex Ventures continued operating, now on its fifth fund with over $50 million under management, generating returns that placed us in the top quartile of early-stage investors. We'd achieved success that was undeniable and sustainable, wealth that provided freedom and security and options. Brandon eventually started dating someone seriously, a woman he met through business connections who understood his driven nature without being threatened by it. They'd talk late into the night about companies and markets and ideas, the kind of intellectual partnership he'd never had before. I watched their relationship develop with cautious hope, wondering if he might finally let someone get close enough to matter. I settled into a pattern of professional success and personal isolation that mirrored his, though I disguised it better with an active social life that didn't include genuine intimacy. I dated occasionally, maintained friendships that were real but carefully bounded, built a life that looked full from the outside but felt hollow when I was honest with myself about it. Our mother asked us once, during a holiday dinner at her house, whether we were okay. Not financially, she clarified. She knew we were fine financially, but actually okay, in the ways that mattered for human well-being, happy, content, at peace. We both assured her we were fine. We talked about our companies and relationships and achievements, painting a picture of successful lives well lived. She listened and nodded and didn't challenge our descriptions, but I could see doubt in her eyes. She knew us too well to accept the surface presentation. She knew that something fundamental had broken in both of us years ago and had never properly healed. But she also knew that some things couldn't be fixed by talking about them, that some losses were permanent, that some changes became part of who you were rather than obstacles to overcome. So she didn't push. She just hugged us both and told us she loved us and was proud of us. In that way, that meant she saw who we really were beneath the success and loved us anyway. The last time I saw Harrison Thornton was 5 years after the coffee shop confrontation. I was back in our hometown visiting our mother, and I stopped at a grocery store to pick up some items she needed. He was in the produce section, looking older than he should have for his age, the years of stress showing in his posture and expression. He saw me and froze, clearly debating whether to acknowledge me or pretend he hadn't noticed. I nodded to him, a minimal gesture of recognition without warmth. He nodded back. We stood there for a moment in awkward silence, two people whose families had destroyed each other in different ways at different times, now just middle-aged men buying groceries in the same store. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, maybe attempt some kind of reconciliation or at least acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. But before he could speak, I turned and walked away. Not dramatically, not with any particular emotion, just a simple choice to not engage with someone who didn't matter to my life anymore. I'd spent years thinking about what I'd say to Thornton if I ever had the chance, imagining speeches about justice and accountability and consequences. But standing there in that grocery store, I realized I had nothing to say to him. Everything that needed to happen had happened. Everything that could be said had been said. He was just someone who'd made choices years ago and was now living with the results of those choices, the same as everyone else. The satisfaction I'd imagined from confrontation never materialized, because there was nothing satisfying about it. He was a man in his 50s buying groceries, worn down by life and consequence, aware that he'd damaged people and been damaged in return, carrying that knowledge without any way to change it. Seeing him didn't feel like victory. It just felt like closure, the end of a story that had consumed too much of my life and my brother's. I called Brandon that night and told him about the encounter. He listened in silence, then asked how it felt. Empty, I said. I thought it would feel like something, but it just felt empty. That's what consequences feel like, he said. That's what accountability looks like in real life. Not dramatic, not satisfying, just reality asserting itself after being deferred too long. The story we tell ourselves about justice is cleaner than the actual experience of justice arriving. Do you regret it? I asked again, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. No, he said without hesitation. I don't regret making sure he faced consequences. I just recognize that those consequences don't undo anything. They don't restore what was lost. They just close the loop and let you move on, for whatever that's worth. We sat in silence on the phone for a while, both of us thinking about the years we'd spent building toward a moment that turned out to be less important than we'd imagined. The companies and wealth and success were real. The accountability we'd enforced was real, but the cost was also real, written in who we'd become and what we'd lost in the process of becoming it. Finally, Brandon spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. The thing I've learned, he said, is that you can't build a life around opposition to someone else. You can't define yourself through revenge or accountability or making sure someone pays for what they did. Because even when you succeed, even when they do pay, you're still the person who spent years focused on them instead of on yourself. You still gave them power over your trajectory, even if it was the power to shape what you built in response to their actions. So what do? I asked. You recognize it, he said. You acknowledge that this is who you became and why you became it. You accept that the cost was real and the damage was permanent and you're not going to recover what you lost. And then you figure out how to build something new that isn't about them at all. That's actually about what you want rather than what you're against. I'm still working on that part, he added. Me too, I said. And that's where we left it. Two brothers who'd spent their adult lives building power and using it to enforce accountability, now trying to figure out how to build lives that meant something beyond that achievement. The companies would continue. The wealth would remain. The success was permanent, but the question of whether any of it added up to lives well lived, to genuine happiness or satisfaction or peace, that remained open. Thornton would continue teaching his computer science classes, carrying the knowledge of what he'd done and what had been done to him, aware that his comfortable life had been built on destroying someone else's future, and that his own comfortable life had been destroyed in turn. He'd go home to his smaller house, his reduced circumstances, his son studying at a good but not great university, and he'd know that all of it traced back to choices he'd made when he had institutional power and used it carelessly. Brandon would continue building companies and making investments, successful by every external measure, wealthy enough to never worry about money again, respected in his fields and recognized for his capabilities. But he'd also carry the knowledge that his success had been purchased with his youth, that the years he'd spent proving Thornton wrong were years he'd never get back, that the walls he'd built to protect himself from institutional betrayal also prevented him from experiencing connection or trust or vulnerability. I'd continue my own version of the same pattern, professionally successful and personally isolated, building wealth and capabilities while remaining distant from genuine intimacy, aware that I was repeating Brandon's trajectory because I'd learned the same lessons he'd learned about how the world actually worked. Our mother would continue living in her paid-off house, financially secure because of our success, proud of what we'd accomplished but aware that we'd paid prices she wished we hadn't had to pay. She'd watch us build impressive careers and maintain careful distance from everyone around us, and she'd understand that something essential had been lost, even as so much had been gained. And all of us would carry the understanding that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. It doesn't restore what was lost or heal what was broken. It just closes loops and enforces accountability and lets you move on, for whatever that's worth. The satisfaction comes not from the moment of confrontation, but from knowing that consequences exist even when they're delayed, that power can be built independent of institutional approval, that you can survive betrayal and build something meaningful on the other side of it. But that survival and that building come at cost, and the cost is written in who you become and what you sacrifice, and what you never quite recover. We won. We built power and used it and made sure accountability happened. We proved everything we needed to prove and achieved everything we set out to achieve. And we live now with the understanding that winning doesn't undo losing, that success doesn't restore what was taken, that you can build an impressive life while remaining fundamentally changed by what made building it necessary. That's the real lesson of revenge, the part they don't tell you in stories where justice feels satisfying and closure feels complete. The lesson is that you can achieve everything you set out to achieve, can make the people who hurt you understand consequence, can build success that proves their accusations false and their power temporary. You can do all of that and still end up fundamentally alone, permanently changed, aware that you spent your adult life responding to something that happened when you were young, and that the response defined you as much as the original injury did. I look at Brandon now, successful and wealthy and respected, dating someone who might finally break through his walls, building a life that might eventually include something beyond achievement and accountability. I see him trying to figure out how to want things for themselves rather than as responses to old wounds, how to build relationships based on connection rather than strategic alignment, how to experience satisfaction that comes from internal motivation rather than external validation or opposition. And I recognize that I'm on the same journey, trying to figure out the same things, carrying the same awareness that we built impressive structures on foundations of trauma and opposition, that our success is real, but also hollow in ways that matter more than we wanted to admit. The Thornton family lives with their reduced circumstances, aware of what they lost and why they lost it, carrying their own version of permanent change and awareness of cost. We all go on, shaped by choices made years ago, living with consequences that arrived eventually, understanding that justice and accountability and revenge don't actually change the past. They just redistribute pain, and close loops and let you move forward into whatever comes next. And what comes next, for all of us, is figuring out how to build lives that mean something beyond the conflicts that shape them, how to find satisfaction in creation rather than opposition, how to experience connection that doesn't feel dangerous, how to be present with what is rather than consumed by what was. I don't know if we'll succeed at that. I don't know if the damage is too fundamental, if we've been shaped too completely by early betrayal and long opposition to transform into something different now. But I know we're trying, both of us, aware that the victory we achieved was real but insufficient, that the justice we enforced was appropriate but unsatisfying, that the power we built was necessary but costly. We won. We made sure accountability happened. We proved everything we needed to prove. And now we live with the understanding that all of that was necessary but not sufficient, that it closed one chapter but didn't write the next one, that success measured by external standards doesn't automatically translate to lives worth living by internal ones. That's what sits with me now, late at night, when the companies are successful and the money is secure and the revenge is complete. The question of whether any of it was worth what it cost, whether we'd choose differently if we could, whether the person I became in pursuit of accountability is someone I actually want to be going forward. I don't have answers to those questions. I just have awareness that they matter, that the next phase of my life and Brandon's will be defined by how we approach them, that the real work isn't behind us in what we built and achieved, but ahead of us in figuring out how to be human in ways that go beyond opposition and calculation and careful control. Thornton faced consequences. We built power. Justice arrived late, but arrived nonetheless. And all of us continue living with what that means, carrying our changes and our awareness and our permanent understanding that some costs are worth paying and some victories are worth achieving, but that doesn't mean the costs disappear or the victories feel the way you imagined they would. That's the truth of it. The part that stories about revenge don't capture because it's not dramatic or satisfying or clear. The truth is that you can achieve everything you set out to achieve, can make the people who hurt you understand pain, can build impressive success from the ruins of early destruction. You can do all of that and still wake up decades later, wondering if you spent your life responding to someone else's choices instead of making your own. If the power you built was worth the isolation it required, if victory measured one way translates to success measured another. I don't regret what we did. I don't forgive what was done to us. I don't apologize for making sure consequences happened when they should have happened years earlier, but I also recognize that all of that is true, while simultaneously recognizing that the cost was real and permanent and written into who we became. And that recognition, that simultaneous awareness of justified action and permanent cost, that's what I carry now. That's what defines the life I'm trying to build going forward. Not the companies or the wealth or the revenge, but the understanding that all of those were necessary responses to real injustice, while also being insufficient foundations for actual human flourishing. We won, and we're still figuring out what that victory actually cost, and whether the price was worth paying, and what comes next now that the battle is over, and the only thing left is living with who we became in the process of winning it. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.